Welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education, a podcast that focuses on what is happening in education today, connecting everyone to the movers and shakers that are breaking boundaries in the education arena.
Hello and welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education. This is Jamie Saponaro, and Jerry Kimball and I have a wonderful guest from CoSN. CoSN is the Consortium for School Networking, and it has always been a proponent for many years for schools working together by promoting partnerships and bringing awareness to emerging technologies in the K-12 arena. So today, more than ever, we are depending on technology to educate our students, and we are depending on collaboration through this technology.
Yes. So I was involved with CoSN as an assistant superintendent, and we know that CoSN is doing so many things, but behind the scenes, the man that I think is making the magic happen is with us today, and that's Keith Krueger. And Keith, I was looking over all of the awards that you've been given. You have been so recognized for what you have been doing, and rightly so. But I want to just let our listeners hear some of the things that you have been recognized for, because they are so important. Keith was selected as the EdTech influencer, IT influencer in 2019. He was also one of the Big 10 most influential people in EdTech for the Center of Digital Education. And he was also identified as one of the top 30 technologists, transformers, and trailblazers. And as I read through all of this, I thought, you are triple T. Technologist, transformer, and trailblazer, all rolled up into one, Keith. And you do all of those things. You meet with the people that are making the decisions and the influencers and the policymakers, and the practitioners. You are one of those people that meets with everyone, and you kind of pull it all together and get us all rowing in the same direction, if you will. So welcome, Keith Krueger. I am honored to have you on the podcast today.
Thanks, Jerry. And my mother thanks you also for those kind of
Absolutely.
What did Woody Allen say? The 90% of success is showing up. And so fortunately, I've had the pleasure of working with CoSN for a long time, and we've been showing up.
You have been showing up, but you do more than show up. You make things happen. And for some of our listeners, not everyone knows what CoSN is, what CoSN does. Jamie alluded to connecting districts, but can you tell us what are some of the things that CoSN does? And the second part of that is, how have you shifted, or have you had to, during this pandemic?
Well, CoSN is a nearly 30-year-old national nonprofit. We represent EdTech leaders. School districts join as a member, as well as we have over 100 corporations, including ClassLink. And we really try to provide, what are the skills needed to lead with technology in this moment. And yes, we like every one of our members. I guess the upside is that this is kind of our moment. We've been talking for almost 30 years about the way that technology can be used, not that it will be used, but can be used when done right, with leaders that understand what's possible. But overnight, last spring, everything changed for everybody, certainly for students, for teachers, for parents, but also for national associations like CoSN. Frankly, a lot of our things we did were face-to-face. Annual conference, regional events, gatherings of district leaders, all that had to be rethought and reimagined. And in fact, next week will be our second virtual annual conference, and it'll be bigger and better than ever before. But we've really had to think about what is it that we can do in unique ways with district leaders. And we got all kinds of exciting things that we've been doing. Just yesterday, over 100 leaders went on what we call our virtual fly-in. We used to, for 20 years now, we've been having a fly-in where people came to Washington, D.C. to meet with their members of Congress and their staff and go to the agencies. We couldn't do that. Couldn't do that last spring. We couldn't do that today or yesterday, but we did it virtually. We did it with this kind of a Zoom introduction, and we had hundreds of meetings with key staffers and members of Congress, making the case that in this moment of remote learning, we need to make some new investments, and that's critical. And we've certainly been working a lot on guidance too, and partners like ClassLink. We have a terrific back to school rubric that kind of indicates all the sort of things that school district leaders need to be thinking about. And the part I like the best is that it shows exemplars, for each indicator of being ready to be back to school, regardless of whether you're 100% face-to-face or 100% virtual or remote, or something in between. What are the exemplars of how you do that?
Keith, we have talked about that rubric with several leaders across the nation. People are really singing the praises of the work that went into that rubric, because I believe that our leaders are so in the weeds with everything that's happening day to day. They love having this rubric where this brain trust of great people and great thinkers have come together and created this rubric of what it is you need. And so they can pick that up literally and look through there. And I am with you. The exemplars are the thing that I like the most, because I like to see great examples. Not that you can totally copy that example, but it really propels you to think of how it can be used in your district.
Jerry, that CoSN's vendor neutral. We don't endorse products or services, but strategic partners like ClassLink, I think, have subject matter expertise. They're like CoSN, working with all kinds of districts, and you start to see where things are happening and where they're not. And so the more that we can highlight and really have these kind of partnerships, it really makes a difference. And I think this moment has also CoSN for over a decade has thought about IT crisis preparedness. If you think back to when Katrina happened, we put out a lot of free resources for school districts thinking about what happens with natural disasters, hurricanes, fires, floods, things like that. Well, the pandemic is something we never talked about. So we've updated all those resources and really rebranded them as learning continuity. And that, to me, is really what this is all about. Because, the pandemic, hopefully in the coming months, will fade. We'll have vaccines. Things will, quote, go back to normal. But we ought to be prepared that, whether you have snow or whether there's some other flu outbreak or kids are sick and need to be at home, we ought to be able to have learning continue.
Right. Many districts are gearing up to have that available in the future. And I love the term continuous learning, no matter what that looks like.
Yeah, with all the initiatives and many that you've already mentioned, you have one special one, the Global Advisory Board, that we wanted to focus on today. Through that, you have identified hurdles and accelerators for innovation that would be driven within K-12 education. So those hurdles that were identified, let's start with those first. Digital equity, scaling and sustaining innovation, as well as evolution of teaching and learning. So can you help us unpack those and let us know how those are hurdles?
This is part of our Driving K-12 Innovation, which Jerry is actually on our board of over 100 advisors, and it is global. It's a global research project that started 13 years ago. It started off actually by another nonprofit, a higher ed association, and it used to be called the Horizon K-12 Report. And 3 years ago, we took it over and rebranded it as Driving K-12 Innovation. And just to, I love that you're starting with the hurdles. I like to think of that as the why. Often when you ask people in charge of technology or innovative educators to think about emerging technologies for learning, they start with the technology. And so I think it's so important to your question we always start with what are the hurdles, what are the things we're trying to overcome and solve with the technology. And this year, you're absolutely right that, and this is an iterative process where judges, advisors like Jerry, it's kind of like Survivor Island, where we discuss a whole bunch of topics. They start with like 30 different possible hurdles, and then it's like Survivor Island, they vote things off. And they discuss them until they pick the 3 most important for this year. And digital equity was at the top of this year's list. And I think that is no question because of the pandemic. We saw immediately that, while at least in the United States, we were making a lot of progress at school with broadband and devices. In fact, 2/3 of classrooms were 1-to-1 at the middle and high school level. But overnight on, around March 13th, we learned that millions, perhaps up to 15 million students do not have connectivity at home or a device at home for learning. And so it's a huge, huge problem, and, absolutely rose to the top of the list of the advisors.
Oh, can I mention one thing as far as digital equity too that I want to put in there? I think people sometimes gloss over the digital equity piece and they think, oh, you have access to the internet via your mom's phone for learning. And that just isn't adequate for students. They need the right tools too. And that is part of that digital equity, making sure they have the right tools that they need to perform the tasks that they need to perform.
You're absolutely right, Jerry. And the lower income that you are, the more likely the way that you access the internet is with a mobile phone. That's not to say you can't do some things with, but boy, can you imagine trying to apply for college, sitting at a McDonald's Wi-Fi, doing it on your or your mom's cell phone? You're at a competitive disadvantage.
Because we're talking about 2 different things here with digital equity. Is that right? The access, right, in terms with device, but then also connectivity as well. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And the devices are a problem, but a bigger problem is home connectivity. It's easy to get easier increasingly with the declining cost of devices to get a device that works. It's harder to pay that ongoing recurring cost for home access. And of course, the lower the income you are, and it's not just a matter of income, it's also a matter of where you live. In rural and remote communities, you can give all the hotspots away to every student, but if you live in a lot of parts of rural America, they're not going to work.
So Keith, I know you've heard this story, but it bears repeating because it really hit me hard. I had a student that was accessing her homework via her mom's phone, and she told me just outright that she would rather fail a class than tell her teacher that they could not afford to have the internet in their home. And also, when mom's cell phone, when she ran out of minutes, she was done with homework. And she said, I can't buy more homework or more time to do my homework. So I would rather just fail. So in our district, we did provide her a device and a hotspot. She came back to me that next spring, sought me out, which I was so pleased to tell me she's on the honor roll. Think of how we're missing students and failing them just because of that. It had nothing to do with her knowledge or her ability, but everything to do with digital equity.
Well, and you're absolutely right about the challenges. Just because your access that you're able to access on a mobile device or even a hotspot, they're often data capped, and therefore, especially with virtual, like what we're doing right now with video conferencing, you could easily exhaust those caps within a few days of the month, the first few days of the month. And that's not the only problem. We have a new initiative funded by it's a research project with the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. We're looking at 13 very large school districts and looking at the experience for the student. And what we're finding out is that there are surprising things, like some of the devices, some of the Chromebooks that kids have aren't designed to do video conferencing. We're also finding that Wi-Fi, I know in my house, I know that there are certain parts of the house where I don't get a good signal, and didn't until I got a booster. And if you have more, mom and dad and a couple of kids are working in different parts of the house, that's not ever going to work. These are new problems that affect the learning opportunity for students. And so there's been a lot of media coverage about kids that aren't logging on, but do we know why? Is it that they don't have access? Is it that they're depressed? Is it that they're taking care of their sibling? Is it that the Wi-Fi is so terrible, or they have a device that doesn't work? We've got to get better information.
Yeah, digital equity goes so deep. There are so many layers to it and components to it that really need to be looked at in order to properly address it. For sure.
Yeah, and it's more than just, so far we've talked about it, having a device and having broadband, but being able to use it. And we do find that the use of technology, particularly in lower income school systems, often is used for rote learning in less powerful ways. Parents and guardians of lower income kids are less familiar with it, so they can't be they aren't as supportive about how to use it. So there's a whole lot of digital literacy that really is the next level around equity.
Sure. So how about scaling and sustainability of innovation?
Yeah, and that has been on for the last several years. And I think the easiest way to describe that is you could ask almost every teacher or principal or people who were at the superintendent level, tell me the name of a teacher or a classroom or maybe even a school that's doing powerful things with technology. Everybody today can do that. Mm-hmm. Then if you say, is that the case everywhere? Is that the case? It doesn't matter which classroom you're in or which school. So we're really good at islands of innovation, but we're not connecting those islands.
So that really makes sense that we need to look at not just what it is, but how broad it could be.
Well, and what things, of course, not everything will work in every single classroom with every single teacher, but what are the kinds of things that do work, and how do we get more teachers and students that works for using them, so that it really doesn't matter your zip code or which class you're in or which teacher you got.
Right. And then the third hurdle, evolution of teaching and learning. How is that a hurdle?
Yeah, and I think certainly there are teachers and even new teachers who just, they certainly know how to use the technology for their own personal use, but do they really know how to use it for pedagogy? And this problem isn't a new problem. It probably isn't a problem that will go away overnight, but I think it is a huge challenge. That said, I will say that the pandemic has changed the landscape. EdWeek did a survey last June, and they asked teachers to self-assess their skills. And they said, in the last 3 months, since March, has your ability to use technology significantly increased, somewhat increased, stayed the same? 44% said significantly changed. Another 41% said somewhat changed. I've been at this a long time. I've earned my white hair. We've never in 3 months seen the needle move that quickly. And I think that is the opportunity to leverage. I think a whole lot more teachers, as well as students and parents, see what could be happening when it's done right.
When it's done right. I still
think we have a long way to go. Yeah.
I think that's the differentiator, right? Because it's one thing to know how to use the tool, but it's quite another to know how to meaningfully integrate it. I always say, the curriculum instruction plays the lead while the technology plays the supporting role. So you can get the understanding of what that tool does, but now let's think about how we can actually make it meaningful. So we don't want to use Google Forms just to duplicate a multiple choice test that may not have been so great to begin with. Instead, let's think of how we can embed critical thinking instead. So that way it's higher level thinking.
Yeah. And you know, these self-assessments by teachers are interesting because sometimes the more, as you start to learn more, the more harsher you self-assess that you're doing worse. So we have kind of a counterintuitive that some of our most sophisticated teachers realize that they have still a long way to go on the journey. And maybe we all are that way. The more we get exposed to it, the more we realize the journey we have to do.
Yes. It does get longer sometimes, for sure. Yeah. All right. So what about the accelerators?
Yeah, so that's the second part, the second bucket. And accelerators looks at, I like to think of this as how do we swim with the tide versus against the tide. So what in the larger world or in the world of education is changing that we can use technology to help, you know, move things along. And so the accelerators that our experts, like Jerry told us this year, were personalization, social and emotional learning, and learner autonomy. And I want to jump first to that second one, social emotional learning, because as I said, we've been doing these reports annually for 13 years. Social emotional learning was never on the list of accelerators until last year. And I think that speaks to the moment. Yeah. And I think if anything, it rose to the occasion, just like digital equity, that we're realizing, especially in the pandemic, the emotional stress that students, as well as teachers and parents, are under. And it's, to be very honest, and you know, CoSN, we've been at this for, you know, almost 30 years. We've never really talked about social emotional learning and technology before, but we are now. So next week at our annual conference, we have a social emotional keynote. Mina Shiravasini is going to be talking about how do you self-care for you and your technology team. Mm-hmm. And we're also partnering with CASEL. They're the social emotional learning nonprofit experts. We reached out to them and said, you know, have you created resources for technology leaders? And they said, well, not really. So we partnered, and we're going to be putting out a member brief next week on how does technology either enhance or reduce social emotional learning in this moment.
Or both. Or both, right?
Yes, it has done both. That's what I love about CoSN. You find the problem and then you reach out to get the people connected to try to work on that problem. That's so CoSN in what you just said.
Well, yeah. And we were very volunteer driven, and you know, if you have a great idea or want to work on a problem, we're very we're small staff, very small staff for a national organization. We only have 13 people, and frankly, the subject matter experts are our members, and we tap into them to participate, and the companies like ClassLink, you know, to. Let's not talk about the end product and the sales and solution, but let's talk about, you know, the first 80% of the problem that you have to do regardless of what solution you pick.
Right, right. Well, what about personalization? How has that been an accelerator?
Yeah, and that's not a new trend. It's a global trend. We've seen it. You know, I think we all know from going on Amazon and buying something that immediately it predicts what else you might like to have. We see that whether it's, you know, ordering food for restaurants and, you know, or our expectations around personalization in the world have changed. And I think that has big implications of what students want, and probably what parents want for their students, is not just a cookie cutter education, but something that relates to their passions, that allows them to go deeper. You know, one of the skeptics of technology was a columnist in the New York Times, and she often before the pandemic about having too much screen time. Well, she wrote a column this spring which said, okay, the debate is over, screens won. She said, but what I'm also realizing is that things are changed, and her student, her child, would get up in the morning and be online at 6:30, 7 in the morning, and be done with their schoolwork by 9 in the morning. That now, I guess that that her child was very motivated, and not every child is, but she also thought about how could we use, clearly when her student goes to school, they're filling up whatever 6.5, 7 hours a day. Is there some way that we could use more of the time to go deeper, to more personalize the learning experience? Because that's a real opportunity if we allow students to go at their own pace. And the third trend is learner autonomy. And I think that's the flip side of personalization, which is, helping learners, move at their own pace and really, yeah.
Well, we've been trying to do that with the flipped model classroom, right? That's what it's all about. Mastery learning, learning at your own pace, personalized learning. But it is not easy to do. But when we became forced into the pandemic, well, now teachers realize, well, that's sort of a solution here to this situation. So I think more teachers became open to it and realizing that we can change a little bit. We don't have to do things the same way we've always done.
Well, and I think right now we're at a critical moment where there's such a desire to get back to school, to go back to normal. And what I would hope that every teacher and administrator are really thinking about, normal didn't work for a lot of kids. So how do we build back better than normal? And what is it that we can learn from the things that we've learned the last few months? There are some things that are silver linings that are better. So parent engagement is better. And let me give you an example. In middle and high school in a lot of districts, it's really hard to get parents to show up at night for parent night. So, if they got 10 or 15 parents, that was great. Doing it virtually, Santa Fe Public Schools told us they have over 200 parents showing up for parent night. That's better than what we had before. So maybe there are new and better ways to engage parents than the way we've been doing it traditionally. There's certainly better ways to do professional development. We know that in many large schools, the principals were expected to come down to the central office. That was, an hour each way in traffic, maybe longer in school districts like Los Angeles. If they can do that virtually, and maybe you can do, all staff convenings only happened maybe the week before school ever started, and that was the end of it. Well, maybe there's new opportunities. We're hearing from innovative superintendents that they're doing, coffee and the superintendent virtual check-ins, and let the parents and community show up and ask questions of things. So there are better opportunities.
Right. And I think districts are having that conversation about what will we keep? And I'm hearing that the parent-teacher conference is one thing that they really do want to keep and to keep going. I wanted to bring up one point on learner autonomy. When we give students devices and access and they finish their work, I hear some school leaders really concerned about using the tool other than for school or another family member using the tool. And that concerns me on several levels. First of all, I lived in a very rural community for several years. My son wanted to learn to play the guitar. It was an hour drive each way, and they were having him play hot cross buns. Not interested. So one day I come home from school and he is jamming on this guitar, and I'm thinking, what in the world? And there on his lap sits his phone and YouTube, and some 7 or 10-year-old is teaching him the guitar. And what I loved about that, what really changed my viewpoint on that was learner autonomy. He is taking his learning in his own hands. Was it something assigned at school? No. Is it something he loves? Yes. And is he learning how to learn? Yes. Love that. I think when we focus so much on this is the school tool, I think we're going to really limit our students. I also had a student tell me that once she had a device in her home, her mother was she didn't speak English. And so she got on the device and used Google Translate and found a job. I mean, these things change lives. And for us to limit that, it scares me.
I think you're right, Jerry. And I think one of my passions has been thinking about how do we break out of the silo. Educators think in the silo of education, and that this is money that we can only use for we took a delegation a few years ago. In fact, it's been almost a decade, and down to Uruguay. Uruguay is a relatively poor country in South America, but at the presidential level, they decided that the way they would address social equity was through providing a device for every student in every home, and they put Wi-Fi connectivity within 6 blocks of every house in Uruguay. Well, we saw that at night, after the kids had gone to bed, those same devices were used by the mothers. They offered nutrition programs. And you think about the same families that are unconnected for remote learning are the same families that have extra health problems. They need to do diabetes management. There's the same families that are unemployed that need to be connected so that they can find a job. So we could, as a country, if we invested in broadband connectivity and got everyone connected, it has huge societal impacts, just like the highways that we put in the 1950s. We didn't say, well, it can only be used for commerce, or it can only be used to get to school. The highway could get you everywhere.
I love that analogy. That is great. That is great. Keith, as you think of all of these things that are moving K-12 forward and some of the hurdles that we need to get over, I had a mentor one time, and Jamie has heard me ask this question before. I'm going to start calling it the Wyckoff question because that was his last name. He would always ask me after we talked, what has become clear? So through all of this research and in the pandemic, what's become clear to you, Keith?
One of the things we've heard repeatedly is that, and clearly we've already talked about digital equity, but one of the other things we've learned is that there are almost too many tools, and it's too complicated. If you don't have kind of a simple way to get on a platform that has all the tools, and that you don't need all of the different sign-ons, and the complexity needs to be made simpler. And just having the wild west of every free tool that every teacher can find doesn't help move the needle. So that's a big problem. Another big problem, and I know that that's a big passion for you, Jerry, and for ClassLink. Another one that I think is there's been this assumption that providing the network through federal monies and E-rate is sufficient. But what we're finding is that it has to be safe connection. And cybersecurity is a real rising problem that I think has been almost ignored in K-12. And yet, just in December, the FBI, the Homeland Security, and MSISAC, which is the Internet Safety Commission, put out a joint warning that K-12 is the #1 targeted public sector for ransomware. And that has become ever more realized in this moment of the pandemic. It's probably not something that you want that the average teacher or parent is thinking about, but boy, our technology leaders really need to help all of students and teachers that you can't click on everything. You have to be sophisticated, or else you're going to lose your identity. You're going to lose your data. Student information is going to become accessible, and we're all going to be held hostage.
It's interesting because almost this time last year at AASA, CoSN was able to bring to the forefront many presentations from different school leaders that helped to shed the light on this and really bring awareness to this. And I think we were really starting to, that was a priority, right? That was up here. But then, of course, 2 months later, or a month later, right? A month later, the pandemic hits. And so now that security is down here on the list. But I'm hoping now that it's starting to rise back up because we're even more vulnerable because people are online more so.
Yeah, and we have filed, along with the state directors of technology and a number of other organizations, with the Federal Communications Commission, because E-rate is the largest funder of technology, but it hasn't been allowable to cover modern kind of cybersecurity. So we're working on that, and we'll see. We're hopeful that the new administration and the new FCC will take this account.
Well, Keith Krueger, we appreciate you and all of the things that you're doing to advocate for all kids. Every time I have a conversation with you, I walk away a little more informed and a little more committed. And I hope that our listeners feel the same way. And I thank you for your work, and thank you for always keeping us informed as to what's happening. I learned some new things today that I didn't know, and I always appreciate that about you.
Well, and I want to thank, ClassLink for you and ClassLink. ClassLink is a terrific diamond level partner, our highest level partner, and they really, work together with us to provide great resources. They support our superintendent's digital superintendent award and our empowered superintendent initiative. And monthly, we do a webinar on EdWeb with superintendents talking about these sort of issues. So thank you, and we appreciate the whole team there.
You bet. I think if we've learned one thing through this pandemic, is that schools can't do this alone.
No.
It's the partners in the community, and we all have to come together to educate our students and make it relevant. So thank you so much.
So great. And, you are a leader in this, leading us through this, and we really appreciate this. But how can other schools get involved, and where can they find you to do so?
Yeah, just go to CoSN.org, CoSN.org. I hope that, if you haven't yet signed up, you have another few days. Next Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, March 2nd to 4th, we'll have our CoSN conference. All the details are at CoSNconference.org. And this year, for the first time ever, we always gave a discount if like a second or third person from a district came, but we've completely changed that with team registrations, and it's based on the size of your student population. So, maybe 2 or 3 people could come from your district in the past because of travel constraints. Now your whole team can come. So we're having the biggest conference ever next week, and it's called Bold and Brave, because that's what we think leaders need to focus on. And we're going to start with Ken Shelton, who's going to think about this moment of racial reconciliation. What's the role of technology leaders in moving that along? We're going to hear from Weston Kenishik talking about kind of blended learning and being bold. He has a new book on that. And ending, as I said, on kind of self-care with Mina, who's going to be, talking about how do you take care of yourself and how do you take care of your technology team, because you're no good to those students and teachers if you're not taking care of yourself.
That's exactly right. We had Ken Shelton on our show, so if people want to get a glimpse of who Ken is, you can never hear enough of him. They can check out his podcast. It was terrific. So I'm looking forward to next week.
See you all there.
You bet.
Thank you for listening. And if you would like to stay linked up, be sure to follow us on Apple and Spotify, and subscribe to us on YouTube.